Everton are rubbish. They've got all of these problems off the field. They've been perennial relegation avoiders across the last few seasons, and they've started off this season and they've got 1 point in 4 games. But I'm here to argue that Everton are actually better than you think they are. So on the board in front of me, I've got Everton's underlying numbers from last season and this season, and as you can see, there's lots to be positive about. Now, the most important thing to notice here is in this column here, which is the expected goal difference per 90 column, because as you can see, what Sean Dyche has done over the course of the summer is he's taken Everton's negative expected goal difference and turned it into a positive expected goal difference, which is a really good sign. But the interesting thing is where that improvement has come from, because if we look at these first 2 columns, we can see all of that improvement is coming from the expected goals column. So last season, Everton were putting up 1.2 expected goals per 90 minutes. That has jumped up this season to a whopping 1.8 expected goals per 90 minutes this season. But when it comes to the defensive numbers, we can see there's no change at all. And so what we're seeing here is an attacking improvement from Sean Dyche's Everton. And when you improve your underlying numbers, it's going to have a positive knock-on on the points that you're expected to pick up. So if we look here on this final column, we can see the expected points per 90 has jumped up from last season from 1.1 up to 1.5. That's a massive improvement. And 1.5 points per game will get you 57 points overall at the end of the season. So the underlying numbers suggest that Everton are a comfortably mid-table side. Now, expected numbers are often very abstract. So what does this look like concretely? Well, I've got a shot map here for all of Everton's chances so far this season. And as you can see, this is a pretty decent shot map. We've got 2 circles here in red, which represents the 2 goals that they've scored. But there's lots of really good chances you can see inside the box here. The bigger the circle, the bigger the chance is deemed to be, according to expected goals models. And as we can see, there's a number of really nice chances that haven't resulted in goals. In fact, if we look at the aggregated value of all of these chances, we can see that Everton would be expected to score around 8 goals. As we've said, they've only got 2 of those goals, but they are putting up really good chances. So this is a really good shot map, and to give you a sense of just how good it is, I've got another shot map to compare it to. So this is Tottenham's shot map from this season. Now, Tottenham are a team that everyone is raving about, but actually when we look at their shot map, it's actually very similar to Everton's. In fact, in terms of the expected goals, they put up slightly fewer expected goals than Everton, and as we can see, they're putting up the same kinds of decent chances in central areas as Everton were, but the big difference is that there's more red circles on this shot map, which means that Spurs have been finishing better than Everton. In fact, there's an argument to be made that Everton's shot map is more impressive than Spurs because Everton have put up fewer shots, but they've generated more expected goals, which means that Everton have a higher expected goal per shot. So according to the underlying numbers so far, everything is looking juicy for Everton, but there are some caveats that we do need to get out of the way. And the first caveat is noise. So on the board in front of me, I've got a really nice viz from my friend Stephen Russell, and what he's showing in this viz is the way that expected projections change across the course of a season. Now, this is a very complicated viz, but it's actually very simple to read, because if we take the central line here, the 0 line, that is how close that your projections are to what finally ends up happening. So the further you are on the graph away from that central line, the worse your projections are. And as you can see, as the season goes by, these projections become increasingly accurate as we have more and more information available about each one of those teams. The important thing to notice for us is that there's lots of wild variance until around the 10th game of the season, which suggests that actually using underlying numbers before the 10th game of the season means that you're not going to be able to make much of a prediction. So for example, we're talking about Everton after 4 games, and as we can see, there's lots of wild variance here. So we do need to take our projections with a pinch of salt. Another caveat that we have to make is that 3 of the games that Everton have played so far have been teams that you would expect to finish in the bottom half this season, which might actually skew the numbers, make Everton look better than they are. And so to assess this, I compared Everton's numbers this season to their performances against teams in the bottom half last season, and here's what I found. Now, obviously, taking away the performances against top half teams last season means that Everton's numbers do look better, but interestingly, that expected goal difference per 90 is still a negative figure. So if we jump forward to this season, we can see that even playing against teams in the top half, Everton's expected goal difference per 90 is better than it was last season against bottom half sides. And so the argument that Everton's numbers look better this season because they played teams around them doesn't actually hold that much water. But again, this data shows up that interesting phenomenon that we noticed earlier, which is that Everton are improving in terms of their attacking numbers, not their defending numbers, which I think is the opposite of what most people would expect from a Sean Dyche team. And this is reflected in the 10-game rolling XG for and against for the whole of Sean Dyche's time so far. So as you can see, there's been a slight decline in their defensive numbers, but that's been matched by a much better increase in terms of their attacking chances as well. And what we see now is that Sean Dyche has got Everton to to about parity. This is where you want them to be, at least as a baseline, where your expected goals for and your expected goals against are starting to match up. And this got me thinking, what is better for teams who are trying to avoid relegation? Is it better to try and stop goals, or is it better to try and score goals? Well, obviously it's better if you can do both well, and that shows up really nicely on this viz that has been made for me by Soccer Men. So on the x-axis here, we have non-penalty expected goals going up. So the better teams in terms of attack are going to be on this side of that axis. On the other axis, it's an inverted axis with expected goals against. So the better teams are going to be at the top because they've conceded fewer expected goals. So the worst teams are at the bottom. And what this means is we now have 4 quadrants. We have teams at the top corner here who have a good attack and good defense. And unsurprisingly, we've got a lot of green dots here because if you have a good attack and a good defense, you're more likely to be able to survive relegation. Conversely, in the bottom quadrant here, we have teams with bad attack and bad defense. And there's a lot of red dots here because if you have a bad attack and a bad defense, you're probably going to go down. But what's interesting here is these 2 other quadrants, because in this quadrant we have teams that have a bad attack and a good defense, and in this quadrant we have teams that have a good attack and a bad defense. And historically in those top 5 leagues, what we find is if you have a bad attack and a good defense, you have a 2 out of 3 chance of survival, whereas if you're in this quadrant and you have a good attack and a bad defense, what you find is that you actually only have a 50% chance of survival. So from here it looks as though it's better to have a good defense than a good attack if you're looking to avoid relegation. But it is worth noting that all of these dots here just represent all of the teams who've been within 6 points of relegation since 17-18 in the top 5 leagues. Now, if we throw Everton's current numbers in here, they're actually way off the chart. They are over here. And that means that there's been no team who've put up similar numbers to the numbers Everton are putting up at the moment who've actually been within 6 points of relegation, which suggests actually Everton probably will be all right if they carry on at their current rate. Now, I've got another viz here. This is from Jake Colliari, and what he's done is he's taken the historical Premier League data, he's taken out all of the top 8 teams, and then he's compared the rest of the teams to try and find the metrics which are their best indicators for Premier League survival. Now, the important thing here is magnitude, because the bigger the magnitude, the greater the correlation. And unsurprisingly, we can see that non-penalty expected goals per 90 is a very important indicator that a team is going to avoid relegation. And equally, non-penalty XG against. If you're conceding fewer chances, you're much less likely to go down. But importantly, the biggest indicator of Premier League survival is actually non-penalty expected goal difference. That's the strongest correlation between doing well in that metric and actually surviving in the Premier League. And as we saw, what Sean Dyche has done is he's taken Everton, who had a negative expected goal difference, and he's given them a positive expected goal difference. So again, if that carries on for the whole of this season, you'd expect Everton to be in a pretty good place. So that means that for Everton, the signs are largely good this season, but that doesn't mean to say that there aren't some areas of concern. Now, it's tempting to think that underperformance is a good thing because the assumption is that eventually your actual numbers will catch up with your underlying numbers. But it's important to remember that the more you underperform, the more you then have to overperform to catch up with that base level performance. Now, I've just drawn up a table to illustrate this. So let's say that Everton are trying to get 35 points to avoid relegation. Now, after 0 games, in order to hit that 35-point threshold, Everton need to hit 0.9 points per game across a 38-game season to get that 35 points. Now, this is where Everton are now. They've played 4 games and they've got 1 point. And if they're going to hit that 35-point threshold this season, that means for the remaining games of the season, 34 games, they have to put up 1 point per game. Now, 0.1 point per game doesn't sound like much, but what that means is that for Everton, in order to hit safety, they're going to have to perform at a 38-point season level for the rest of their games. And as we go down the table, if Everton continue to underperform at the rate that they already have, you can see that that point per game requirement to hit safety is just going up and up and up, so that the longer that it goes on, the higher you're having to perform to overcorrect it. All of which suggests that Everton are probably fine as long as their underperformance doesn't continue for the rest of the season. Well, how could we know that? Well, that brings us to model blind spots. Now, what do I mean when I say model blind spots? Well, you may remember in 2019-20 when Liverpool won the Premier League, they massively overperformed their underlying numbers, particularly expected goals. They scored a lot more goals than their expected numbers suggested that they would. And this got some people suggesting that actually Liverpool were a model blind spot. There was something about the way that Liverpool were playing that wasn't accounted for by the model. Now, what if Everton are the same way, but in the other direction? What if there's something about the way that they're playing which isn't accounted for by the model? And so their underperformances could continue for the whole season. And in order to talk about that, we need to talk about how Everton are attacking. So on the board in front of me, I've got 2 playstyle metrics from when Everton were managed by Frank Lampard and now that they're managed by Sean Dyche. And the thing that stands out most for me is in this quadrant of the radar, because as we can see under Sean Dyche, Everton are doing more direct attacks and they are attacking at a greater speed. Now this could account for their attacking numbers going up, because attacking more directly and more quickly could result in more dangerous chances. But at the same time, this could account for why they are missing more chances, because the added element of chaos and speed can make those better chances harder to score. Now I've got examples of both of these things. So in this first screenshot, we've got Everton playing against Wolves. This is Jordan Pickford. He has the ball in his own 6-yard box. And what he's going to do is he's going to play the ball down the field. We're now at 13 minutes, 12 seconds. And within 7 seconds, we now end up with a situation where Danjuma has the ball. He's in a 1v1 against Jose Sarr. Actually, this doesn't result in a goal, but you can see how quickly Everton are moving the ball down the field and generating these sorts of chances. Here's another example against Sheffield United. You can see this is a really nice counter-attack. Everton have 4 players up against 2 defenders for Sheffield United. And in the end, Danjuma has the ball and elects to shoot. The ball is actually blocked here. Now, you would expect most Premier League teams to be able to generate a more dangerous shooting opportunity than this, which indicates a couple of things, I think. One would be that this is part of that speed problem. So Everton are attacking too quickly here to actually be able to make good decisions. And this brings us to a second issue, which could be that these players are unsure what they're supposed to be doing in this scenario to be able to generate a more dangerous chance. And this would be a coaching issue, because if Sean Dyche does want his team to play in this way, he has to prepare them to generate more dangerous chances in these kind of moments. But there's another angle here, and that's the Neal Maupay conundrum, because Neal Maupay has been a member of a couple of teams who've struggled to convert their expected goals. I've got a couple of examples of this happening for Everton. So this is in the game against Fulham. Here's Neal Maupay. Doucouré has just played the ball back across. He's got a 1v1 against the goalkeeper and doesn't score in this situation. This is a high XG chance that doesn't result in a goal. This is another example from the same game. Neal Maupay gets 1v1 against Jose Sarr, and again, it doesn't result in a goal. So it's clear that Neal Maupay is contributing to this XG underperformance by Everton, but Neal Maupay has now left the club, and Everton have brought in Beto, who, despite not being an exceptional finisher, is still much closer to his underlying numbers than Neal Maupay is. So it could be the case that this transfer actually makes this underperformance go away. Now, it is worth saying that whenever I've had a team labelled as a model blind spot, it's taken about a season before they've actually returned to the sorts of numbers you would expect. So I would be extremely surprised if Everton have actually broken any of the models here. So because of all this, Everton are better than you think they are, and if they continue at this rate of performance through the whole season, then they're going to be comfortably above the relegation zone by the time the season ends. But the big worry here is their current level of underperformance, and the longer that this underperformance continues, the bigger the mountain they have to climb to avoid relegation.
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including journalists dedicated to each Premier League team, so every fan gets the coverage they deserve, not just the big clubs. And you can try it for free now for 30 days. See the link in the description.